200 Scottish Highlanders against 3,000 English soldiers. On paper, this was not a battle, this was a massacre waiting to happen. Yet what unfolded at the narrow wooden planks of Stirling Bridge would shatter every rule of medieval warfare. Exhausted clansmen with makeshift weapons, an English army confident of an easy victory, and a young commander whose name England wanted erased forever. But what hidden weakness doomed the English that morning? What secret tactic turned a tiny force into a storm? And how did a single bridge become the graveyard of an empire's pride? This is the impossible battle the English chroniclers tried to bury. The dawn over Scotland did not rise gently, it crawled across a wounded land. Thin ribbons of smoke twisted upward from burned cottages, drifting like ghosts over the highlands. In the quiet hush of morning, the country felt less like a kingdom and more like a battlefield paused between heartbeats. Every ruined home, every charred field whispered the same truth. Scotland was bleeding. Families huddled together in the cold. Children stared at the horizon, waiting for English horsemen who might return at any moment. And in this suffocating tension, the spirit of a fractured nation trembled, half broken, half burning with unspoken fury. Across the mist-soaked hills walked a lone figure. Tall, broad-shouldered, eyes darkened not by age, but by grief. William Wallace, once a simple man, now carried the silent weight of a murdered family and a shattered homeland. His hands, roughened from toil, had become hands of rebellion. The land called to him not with words, but with the ache of every oppressed soul. He traveled from glen to glen, gathering men who had nothing left but anger and memory. Farmers with trembling hands, veterans who had sworn never to fight again, young boys masking fear behind forced courage. They came not because they believed victory was possible, but because not fighting had become unbearable. As Wallace stood upon a ridge overlooking the wide stretch of Stirling and the River Forth twisting like a silver serpent below, he felt the pulse of destiny beneath his feet. The English banners fluttered in the north, an omen of the storm to come. Scotland had no king, no unifying army, no hope the world could see. Yet Wallace looked across his homeland with fire in his eyes, sensing that the smallest spark could ignite an uprising. And far in the distance, drums began to thrum, signaling the English march towards Stirling Bridge. The battle for Scotland's soul was coming. Night had fallen over the Scottish camp like a heavy cloak, muffling every sound except the restless shifting of men unable to sleep. The crescent moon cast pale light across their makeshift encampment, shadows of warriors who looked more like refugees than soldiers. Some prayed, whispering trembling words into their hands. Others sharpened rust-flecked blades slowly, mechanically, as though the rhythm might quiet the fear gnawing at their insides. At the edge of the camp, isolated from the murmurs of his men, William Wallace sat with his back against an ancient oak. The weight of command pressed on him with crushing intensity. Every choice he made would decide not just lives, but the fate of a nation struggling to breathe beneath foreign rule. He closed his eyes, hearing echoes of the past. A woman's scream, chains clattering, flames devouring wooden beams, grief sharpened into resolve. Yet beneath that fire lay a truth he could not deny. He was afraid. Afraid of failing, afraid of leading his people into slaughter, afraid that courage alone was not enough. A young fighter approached him, barely more than a boy, hands trembling as he clutched a spear too tall for his frame. "Will we survive tomorrow?" he asked, voice cracking despite his attempt to sound brave. Wallace studied him, seeing in the boy's eyes the reflection of every Scot who followed him, men who carried fear not as weakness, but as proof of how much they stood to lose. "We will," Wallace said softly, "because we must." Across the river, torchlight flickered in the English camp like a constellation of fire. Their numbers seemed endless, their confidence palpable even from miles away. Yet Wallace felt something shift inside him, not dread, but clarity. The bridge at Stirling was narrow. The ground favored him. And courage, when multiplied by desperation, became a force no army could measure. He rose to his feet as dawn's first chill wind swept across the fields. Tomorrow, Scotland would either rise or be silenced forever. Morning mist clung to the valley like a living thing, curling around the reeds and drifting across the flowing waters of the River Forth. It was a calm, almost peaceful scene, yet beneath that serene surface lay the architecture of fate itself. For battles are not won by numbers alone. Sometimes the land chooses its victor. Stirling Bridge stretched across the river like a fragile wooden spine, narrow, aging, scarcely wide enough for two men to stand shoulder to shoulder. Any army attempting to cross it would be forced into a choke point, their formation broken, their strength reduced to a trickle. Wallace knew this. He had studied the lay of the land with a hunter's precision. Every slope, every reed bed, every angle of the rising sun mattered. From a hillside concealed by bracken and pine, the Scottish force watched the English camp stir to life. It sprawled across the far bank like a small city, thousands of soldiers polishing armor that flashed like silver shards in the morning light. Horses snorted, tents rustled, and commanders barked orders with the easy confidence of an army that believed the day already belonged to them. But confidence blinds. Terrain does not. Wallace crouched low, fingertips brushing the damp soil. The earth was firm, perfect for a sudden charge. Marshland flanked the bridge, soft enough to swallow horses whole. The river's curve meant the English could not maneuver swiftly once trapped on the wrong side. Every natural element conspired in Scotland's favor. His lieutenants whispered behind him, nerves tightening their voices. They'll send cavalry across first. They'll overwhelm us once they're over. They are too many, William. Wallace did not look at them. His eyes remained fixed on the bridge, the thin wooden throat through which the English army would soon try to breathe. They believe numbers win wars, he murmured, but the land disagrees. Below, English soldiers began to approach the bridge, laughing, relaxed, certain of an easy victory. The first boots touched the planks. The trap was slowly, inevitably, beginning to close. The sun had lifted just high enough to cast long, golden streaks across the river when the moment of arrogance arrived quietly, almost casually. On the far bank, English commanders gathered around their standards, voices sharp with impatience. They towered over their maps as if the battle was already a foregone conclusion. To them, Wallace's force was insignificant, a nuisance to be brushed aside before breakfast. But arrogance is the first crack in any empire. Sir Hugh de Cressingham argued fiercely for a rapid advance. Drive them across the hills, he insisted. The Scots are rats. They will scatter the moment we show force. Others hesitated, suggesting scouts, formations, caution. But caution is a language the overly confident rarely understand. Their pride smothered reason. And so, the order was given. Not to circle the marsh, not to flank the high ground, not to force Wallace into open plains where English cavalry reigned supreme. Instead, they would march directly across the narrow bridge. From his concealed ridge, Wallace watched English soldiers begin the slow funneling across the wooden spine. 2 men wide, vulnerable, exposed. Each step, a gift wrapped in English pride. He exchanged a glance with his captains. Their eyes widened as they saw what he saw. The mistake he had prayed for. The mistake no general should ever make. The mistake that would echo through centuries. The bridge groaned under the weight of heavily armored infantry. Horses snorted, uneasy on the cramped planks. Officers shouted to maintain order, but their voices bounced uselessly across the river. 1,000 troops waited behind them, pressing forward, turning the bridge into a clogged artery. Wallace inhaled deeply, the cold air filling his lungs with grim clarity. "Let them cross," he whispered. More, just a little more. On the far bank, the English believed they were beginning a routine advance. On the hillside, Scotland realized destiny had just opened its door. and Wallace's hand slowly, silently, began to rise. For a brief heartbeat, the world held its breath. Mist drifted across the valley floor, as if nature itself tried to veil what was about to unfold. Then, like a spark striking dry tinder, the Scots moved. It began with the soft crunch of boots on heather. Then the rhythm grew, multiplied, surged. Wallace's Highlanders rose from the hillsides in a single sweeping motion, silhouettes emerging from the morning haze like spectres summoned by Scotland's grief. Their voices, low at first, began to rumble into a roar, primal roar that rolled across the river. Below, the English troops, already stranded on the wrong side of Stirling Bridge, froze mid-step. They had expected a retreat. They had expected fear. They had expected the Scots to scatter. Instead, they saw an avalanche of defiance thundering toward them. The narrow bridge behind them clogged instantly. Officers shouted contradictory orders: advance, hold, retreat, their commands colliding like shields in the chaos. Horses reared, trapped by the bottleneck, their riders unable to maneuver. Infantry pressed forward blindly, unaware that the very path ahead was collapsing into disaster. And still the Scots came. Highlanders, kilts whipping in the wind, charged with a unity born from shared suffering. Their formation tightened as Wallace led them downhill, every stride fueled by the memory of humiliation and loss. They moved not as 200 individuals, but as a single living force, a storm of fury shaped by strategy. The English front line tried to brace, but the ground betrayed them. Marshlands sucked at their boots, the river cut off their flank, the bridge behind them denied escape. Wallace raised his voice above the chaos. Now, drive them into the water. The Scots collided with the English like a hammer shattering glass, symbolically, powerfully, the sound echoing across the valley. The English ranks twisted, crumpled, compressed under their own weight. Panic rippled through their lines as they realized they were isolated and hopelessly outnumbered in the very space that should have protected them. Dust rose in swirling clouds. Banners snapped violently. The cries of men merged with the roar of the river. The trap had not only closed, it had begun to crush. The English line trembled, ready to break. The air itself seemed to crack as chaos erupted across the riverbank. The English soldiers, caught between the oncoming Scottish tide and the clogged bridge behind them, felt the first tremor of panic rippling through their ranks. What began as confusion now transformed into desperation. Officers shouted until their voices broke, trying to force order into the tightening knot of men, but the river, the mud, the narrow bridge, and Scotland's fury conspired against them. The Highlanders hit with the force of a storm unleashed. Their battle cries echoed down the valley, not as scattered screams but as a unified roar, centuries of oppression compressed into a single sound. Steel flashed in the sunlight, boots thundered across the marsh, and dust rose like smoke from the earth itself. On the bridge, disaster multiplied. More English soldiers pressed onto the planks, unaware that those ahead were being driven backward. The structure groaned under the combined weight of men and horses. Knights at the rear shouted at infantry to move forward. Infantry screamed that they could not. The entire army began to choke on its own size. From the hillside, Wallace watched with a commander's clarity. Every detail sharpened, the rising panic, the shifting of English shields, the quiver in their formation. "They're breaking," he murmured. He lifted his sword, and the Highlanders surged again. The English line buckled like softened iron. Men stumbled into the river, swallowed by the current. Others fell back in disorder, only to collide with those still pushing forward from the bridge. The battlefield became a whirlpool of collapsing discipline. Horses reared, trapped with nowhere to turn. Standards dipped, officers lost control. The sound of retreating footsteps collided with the cries of those still trying to hold the line. Then came the moment that sealed it all. The bridge shuddered violently, one beam cracking like thunder. Panic shot through the English formation as the planks trembled beneath them. A single flaw in the structure radiated outward like a death ripple. Men froze where they stood. Wallace's voice rose above the bedlam. For Scotland, press them back. The Highlanders obeyed, with a final, explosive charge that tore through the remaining English resistance. The enemy's will snapped. Their formations disintegrated into full collapse. What had begun as an arrogant advance now became a frantic, hopeless retreat. Across the field, English banners dipped, wavered, and began to fall. By midday, the battlefield had fallen eerily quiet. The thunder of hooves, the clash of armor, the shouts of commands all had faded, leaving only the river's steady murmur and the distant cry of circling crows. Smoke drifted in thin ribbons across the trampled grass, carrying with it the scent of broken shields, churned mud, and the bitter tang of fear that had only hours before filled the air. The English army, once a confident, glittering force of thousands, was now scattered in humiliation. Survivors fled south in disordered waves, their armor clattering as they stumbled away from a battle they had never truly understood. Their banners, so proudly raised in the morning light, now lay abandoned in the mud, soaked and torn. What had begun as a march of dominance had ended as a retreat of shame. On the northern bank, Wallace's men stood in stunned silence. Victory, true, undeniable victory, felt unreal. Many stared at the ruined field with wide eyes, as though waking from a dream they feared pinching themselves out of. Mothers, farmers, shepherds, men who had known nothing but burden and loss, now stood taller, breath-forming clouds of pride in the cool air. Villagers emerged slowly from wooded hiding places, walking among the remnants of English gear with a cautious awe. To them, the sight was impossible, that a small force, outnumbered more than 15 to 1, had held its ground and won. At the center of them all stood Wallace, his expression unreadable. Triumph flickered in his gaze, but so too did the weight of what came next, for he understood better than any that this victory, monumental as it was, would not end the struggle. England would return angrier, larger, more determined. But today, Scotland had risen. The men around him began to chant his name, hesitant at first, then swelling into a roar that rolled across the valley. A legend had been born, and legends do not fade quietly. In the quiet that followed Stirling Bridge, Scotland felt different, changed not by the clash of steel, but by the awakening of something deeper, older, unyielding. The river still flowed beneath the broken planks, carrying away the echoes of battle, yet its waters now shimmered with a symbolic light. What happened here was no mere military victory. It was a reminder to Scotland, to England, and to history that the human spirit bends only so far before it becomes unbreakable. Across the Highlands, tales of the triumph spread like wildfire. Shepherds told it to children by the hearth. Travellers whispered it along roads still heavy with the footprints of retreating English soldiers. For the first time in years, a weary land dared to believe that freedom was not a story for the distant past or a dream for the far future. It was real. It had a location. It had a beating heart. And its name was Stirling Bridge. But Wallace, standing upon a hill where wind tugged at his cloak, understood the broader truth. Victory did not end the struggle, it began it. England's pride had been wounded, but its power remained vast. Battles would follow, losses would follow. Yet the message had already been carved into stone. A nation's strength is not measured by the size of its armies, but by the fire within its people. The bridge, now splintered and scarred, had become more than a crossing. It had become a testament to the courage of the few who stood against the many. A reminder that strategy can defy might, that resolve can defy oppression, that history can pivot on the choices of those who refuse to bow. And as the Highland winds swept across the fields, it carried with it a truth Scotland would never again forget. Freedom begins when fear ends.